The court system failed. The criminal walked free. Justice wasn't served. So, some individuals decided to serve it themselves. Vigilante justice sounds appealing when you first hear about it. Bad guy does something terrible. The system lets them go. And then someone steps in to make things right. Quick, brutal, satisfying. The kind of justice that feels good because it's immediate and doesn't get tangled up in legal technicalities. But that's not even the worst part. Vigilante justice isn't clean or heroic. It's messy, often wrong, and leads to innocent people dying. Throughout history, some of the most extreme cases of vigilante justice have resulted in mass violence, racial terror, wrongful executions, and pure mob chaos that made the original crime look tame by comparison. Let's talk about what vigilante justice actually looked like when real people decided to take the law into their own hands. Not the Hollywood version. The brutal, ugly, historical reality. The San Francisco Vigilance Committees, when the wealthy decided who lived. San Francisco in the 1850s was chaotic. The gold rush had flooded the city with fortune seekers, con artists, criminals, and desperate people from all over the world. The official justice system was overwhelmed and corrupt. Politicians took bribes. Criminals bribed their way out of jail. Actual dangerous people walked the streets freely. So in 1851, a group of prominent businessmen formed the Committee of Vigilance. They decided they'd handle crime themselves since the government clearly couldn't. This sounds reasonable until you understand what they actually did. The committee would arrest suspects, hold their own trials, and execute people within hours. No real defense attorneys, no appeals, no oversight. Just a group of wealthy men deciding who deserved to die. They hanged people in public. They'd build gallows in the street, march the condemned person up, put a noose around their neck, and execute them while crowds watched. Then they'd leave the body hanging for hours as a warning. And this is where your life really falls apart. If you were an immigrant, especially Irish or Hispanic, you were already more likely to be targeted. If you'd crossed one of the committee members in a business deal, you might find yourself accused of a convenient crime. If you were poor and couldn't defend yourself, you were done. In 1851 alone, they hanged 4 men and deported dozens more. By 1856, they'd grown into a full shadow government. Thousands of members, overriding elected officials, raiding jails, surrounding buildings with armed men, and executing at least 4 more people. They claimed they were cleaning up the city. What they actually did was establish a system where wealthy businessmen could execute anyone they wanted and call it justice. You think that's bad? Wait. Lynching in America. Terror, disguised as justice. You can't talk about vigilante justice without talking about lynching in America. And this is where vigilante justice reveals itself for what it really is: organized terror against vulnerable people. Between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,400 Black Americans were lynched in the United States. The real number is probably much higher because many lynchings went unrecorded. These weren't isolated incidents of angry mobs acting on impulse. Lynchings were systematic, organized, and often involved entire communities. Here's how it typically worked. A Black person would be accused of a crime. Sometimes there was no crime at all, just a perceived violation of social norms, like talking back to a white person or looking at a white woman. The accusation was enough. But that's not even the worst part. A mob would form, sometimes hundreds or thousands of people. They'd drag the accused from their home or from jail. Local police often helped or stood aside. They'd torture the person, beating, mutilation, burning. These weren't quick executions. They were prolonged spectacles of violence designed to terrorize the entire Black community. Crowds watched as if it were entertainment. People brought their children. They took photographs. They cut off body parts as souvenirs. They sold postcards of the lynching. And this was all called justice. You think that's bad? Wait until you hear this one. Take Emmett Till in 1955. He was 14 years old. He supposedly whistled at a white woman in a store in Mississippi. That was his crime. Whistling. 2 white men kidnapped him, beat him brutally, shot him in the head, tied a heavy metal fan to his body with barbed wire, and threw him in a river. When they were tried for murder, an all-white jury acquitted them in just over an hour. Years later, one of the men admitted they'd done it. The woman later admitted she'd lied about what Emmett had done. A 14-year-old boy was tortured and murdered because of a lie, and the community called it justice. This happened thousands of times, and the people who did it were never punished. The Oxbow Incident, when the mob got it wrong. And this is where your life really falls apart, if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In 1885, near Oxbow, Nevada, 3 men were hanged by a posse for cattle rustling and murder. The posse was convinced these men had stolen cattle and killed a local rancher. They held a quick trial in the wilderness, found the men guilty, and hanged them from a tree. Then they found out the rancher wasn't actually dead. He'd been injured but was alive. And the 3 men they'd just executed hadn't stolen any cattle. They were completely innocent. The posse had murdered 3 innocent men because they were too impatient to wait for an actual investigation, too certain of their own rightness to consider that they might be wrong, too swept up in mob mentality to think clearly. But that's not even the worst part. This wasn't a rare exception. It was the rule. The problem with vigilante justice is that it moves fast based on emotion and assumption. Real justice requires time, investigation, evidence, and the opportunity to defend yourself. Vigilantes skip all of that because they're certain they're right. And when they're wrong, innocent people die. The Leo Frank lynching. Anti-Semitism masquerading as justice. You think that's bad? Wait. In 1913, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan was murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager, was accused of the crime. The trial was a circus. The prosecution's case was weak and relied heavily on testimony from a black janitor who was clearly coerced and probably the actual killer. But Frank was Jewish, and anti-Semitism in the South was rampant. The jury convicted him largely because of his religion and northern background. Frank was sentenced to death, but the governor commuted his sentence to life in prison after concluding Frank hadn't received a fair trial. And this is where your life really falls apart. A mob of about 25 men, including prominent citizens, broke into the prison farm where Frank was held. They kidnapped him, drove him 175 miles to Mary Fagan's hometown, and hanged him from a tree. Photographs of his body were taken and sold as postcards. The men who did it were never punished. They became local heroes. Years later, evidence emerged strongly suggesting Frank was innocent, that the janitor had actually committed the murder. But Frank was already dead, executed by a mob more interested in punishing a Jewish outsider than finding the real killer. The Montana Vigilantes, frontier justice gone wild. But that's not even the worst part. The Montana Territory in the 1860s was rough. Gold had been discovered, thousands of people flooded in, and crime was everywhere. So vigilantes took over, forming secret committees and starting to hang anyone they suspected of crimes. At first, they targeted actual outlaws. The Plumber Gang were genuine road agents who'd been robbing and killing. Hanging them seemed justified. But then the vigilantes kept going. You think that's bad? Wait. They started hanging people based on rumor and suspicion. If someone had a grudge against you, they'd whisper to the vigilantes. You'd find a warning notice on your door, a grave drawn with the numbers 3777. Nobody knows exactly what the numbers meant. But if you found one, You knew you'd been marked for death. In just a few months in 1864, Montana vigilantes hanged at least 24 people. Some were guilty. Some were almost certainly innocent. One man was hanged not for committing a crime, but simply for being suspected of knowing criminals. That was enough. And this is where your life really falls apart. The vigilantes themselves were often using justice as a cover for eliminating business competitors, settling personal grudges, or just enjoying power over life and death. The New York draft riots, when vigilante violence targets the innocent. In July 1863, New York City exploded. The Civil War draft had just been announced, and poor white workers, especially Irish immigrants, were furious. Wealthy men could pay $300 to avoid service. The poor had no choice. The anger turned into a riot. 4 days of chaos. But that's not even the worst part. The mob didn't just attack draft offices. They turned their rage on black New Yorkers, people who had absolutely nothing to do with the draft. They beat them. They hanged them from lampposts. They burned down the colored orphan asylum while children were inside. At least 120 people were killed, most of them black New Yorkers who were simply convenient targets for white rage. The mob claimed they were fighting for justice, for fairness, against a system that oppressed poor workers. What they actually did was murder the most vulnerable people around them and call it righteous. The Detroit race riot of 1943, vigilante violence on both sides. You think that's bad? Wait. In June 1943, racial tensions in Detroit exploded into a full-scale riot. White mobs dragged black people from streetcars. They pulled black drivers from their cars. They attacked black-owned businesses. Black vigilante groups fought back, attacking white people in their neighborhoods, destroying white-owned businesses. Both sides claimed they were delivering justice, defending their communities. And this is where your life really falls apart. 34 people died, hundreds were injured, millions in property destroyed. And the underlying problems that caused the riot? Left completely untouched. Vigilante justice didn't solve anything. It just created more death, more trauma, more destruction. Why vigilante justice always fails? Looking at all of this, a pattern emerges. Vigilante justice is too fast. It doesn't allow time for investigation, for evidence, for separating truth from rumor. Mobs act on emotion. But that's not even the worst part. It's deeply biased. Racism, classism, religious hatred, personal grudges, all of it shapes who gets targeted and who gets protected. And there's zero accountability. When official law enforcement makes mistakes, there's supposed to be oversight and consequences. When vigilantes make mistakes, they just move on to the next target. You think that's bad? Wait. It almost always punishes the wrong people. Innocent people die. The actual guilty escape. Justice isn't served, it's perverted. The uncomfortable truth. Here's what history teaches us about vigilante justice. It's almost never about justice at all. It's about power, settling scores, giving violent people an excuse to commit violence and call it righteous. And this is where your life really falls apart. Every single historical example shows the same pattern. It starts with genuine frustration about crime and system failures. It escalates quickly into mob violence, and it ends with innocent people dead and the actual problems completely unsolved. The legal system isn't perfect. It never will be. But the alternative, letting angry mobs decide who lives and dies, is infinitely worse. But that's not even the worst part. The people who did all of this truly believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were protecting their communities, delivering justice, making things right. Believing you're right doesn't make you right, and killing people without due process doesn't become justice just because you're angry. History has shown us that clearly. We just have to be willing to learn from it.